In mid-October, at the peak of apple season, I picked a whole bunch of apples with the goal to turn them into hard cider. Now, getting the juice out of the apples can be a challenging task, and at first I thought I could just cut them up into slices, throw them in my food processor, and pulse them until they were mush, and then place them in a mesh bag and squeeze the daylight out of them, and get juice. Simple, right? Well, the short answer is yes, you can do this, but what I learned is the yield is pretty crappy, and it's very manually intensive. To give you an idea, I used 16 apples, and it only gave me 2 cups of juice, and I wanted to make at least a gallon of juice. Now, the most common way to crush your apples is with a fruit crusher, and then use a fruit press to squeeze the juice out of them. So I looked around to rent or buy one, but the cost of renting one for just an afternoon was about $50. So I continued to look for an alternative way, like a juicer, and that's when I found this juicer attachment that was able to work with my KitchenAid stand mixer. This one was only $35, so I went ahead and ordered it to test it out. Now, to assemble, the first thing you need to do is unscrew the front face plate and insert the corresponding feeder. Next, add the mesh screen that will push the fruit mush out and separate it from the juice. The black knob locks it all together, and the seal-looking drip tube allows juice to flow into one of the 2 cups with the mush going into the second. Then turn the stand mixer to somewhere between 2 to 4 on the speed dial and start feeding the apples in, which will crush them, press them, and slowly drip the apple juice. You'll see that in the cup. I'm not sure how many pounds of apples it took, but I continued to slice up apples and feed them through this juicer until I yielded around 5 liters of juice, which is just over a gallon. And every time I filled up this cup, I poured it in my kettle, and then it was time to heat pasteurize the juice before pitching the yeast. So I increased the temperature on my kettle to 170 degrees Fahrenheit and held it there for 10 minutes. At that point, I also added in a cinnamon stick as well as some yeast nutrient to help out the yeast later. I then cooled it down to the proper yeast temperature and poured it all in my clean and sanitized keg for fermentation. I chose this Mangrove Jack Cider yeast based on its description of revealing the full fruit character, but much more on that later and how it turned out. I just kind of poured some of the yeast over top of it and sealed it up and attached a blowoff tube for fermentation. The original gravity of the juice was 1040, and this is the carnage of all the leftover apples afterwards. It healthily bubbled away for about 2 weeks, and then I took the final gravity, reaching 1.000. I then pressure transferred it from my fermentation keg to my smaller serving keg of 10 psi and chilled it down before letting it condition for 1 week in my fridge before trying it. And this is how the hard cider turned out. All right, so this is the hard cider that I made using the apples that I picked myself. I then used the juicer attachment on my stand mixer, and I think that was a really good cheap way to make apple juice. You know, it was maybe 30-40 bucks for the piece. Worked great. It just took a little while compared to like the first method which I tried, which was squeezing by hand and just using a food processor. That had a very low yield of getting juice out from the apples. And then I know the other way you probably could do it is with a mill and then like a apple press. One tip I've learned from my friends is that a really good way to get extra juice yield out of that, if you can press your apples, is actually once you grind them, use an immersion blender, and that really helps break up the pieces of the apples and get more juice out of it. Let's see how this one turns out. Started at 1040, ended at 1 gravity, so it's about 5% alcohol. You know, it's still super hazy. This is only about 3 weeks old now, being in my keg. On the aroma, it is like very appley, but I will say that there is an off flavor in the aroma, and I'm not really sure how to describe it. It kind of reminds me of like sulfury apple is kind of the best way I can describe it. And like the off flavor is not there on the taste. This is super dry. It did finish at 1 and I didn't back sweeten it at all. It's nice and clean, but I think the aroma that the off flavor is coming from is the yeast that I chose. I've had success making cider before with no off flavors, no aroma issues. And I'll link that video down below. I just used store-bought cider and the Verdant IPA yeast. That turned out fantastic, and I highly recommend that. But I think going back to this specific batch, I mean, it was such a small amount. I only made about 5 liters, and in the end, probably a gallon of hard cider. And that was like 40 apples, maybe more. So if you have an excess of apples, do it this way. Otherwise, it's probably easier and cost effective to just go buy freshly pressed juice that's unpasteurized to make it in the future. The color is super hazy. It's like this nice yellow color, but again, it's not clear at all. I didn't use any finding agents on it. Yeah, and on the aroma, it's just kind of like ripe apple and sulfur. I think that's kind of the best way I can describe it. It's not super unpleasant, but it's not pleasing to the nose. There's no off flavors in the actual cider when you drink it. It's very dry. So if you're looking for a sweeter cider, definitely back sweeten it if that's your choice. Oh yeah, one more thing. The cinnamon stick that I added to this was not enough. There's no cinnamon characteristic whatsoever. So I think definitely adding more cinnamon into the boil or when I steeped it at 170 degrees when I was pasteurizing the apple cider itself, doing heat pasteurization, add more cinnamon sticks to that. If you like this type of content, I appreciate it if you subscribe. If you want to see how to make apple cider from store-bought juice and using the Verdant IPA strain, click the video on the screen right now. I'll see you again soon. Cheers.